My name is Joseph Sciorra. This is the Calandra Corner, and where we talk about all things pertaining to Italian migration. And we understand often Italian migration as people moving across borders, ideas moving across borders, but we often don't think about translation and the idea the ways in which things move from Italian to English, from English to Italian, and other languages as well, back and forth across the border. And so with that, I'm really happy to have with us today Michael Moore, a translator. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Joe. Very nice to be here.
So as I said before we started recording, I actually don't know enough about your work and the kinds of translation that you've done regarding Italian. So if you could tell us all a little bit.
It's a long history, but I'll make it short. You know, I work as a translator and as an interpreter. I was studying for my PhD at NYU, and being very fluent in Italian, and in a department at the time filled with just Italians, we would get phone calls from various places in New York. The first one actually being a Central Park, which needed an interpreter for the gondola. And, so they sent me. And so every time, which was probably the best job I ever had, just sitting in a gondola saying right, left, as these two guys from Venice were instructing the boys of the boathouse how to row, in that sort of standing up style, a gondola. And from there, so basically I sort of started out doing some interpretation, doing some translation here and there. But then publishers would call. So I started translating books. So I've translated different kinds of books, ranging from nonfiction. I did one of the Vatican Leaks books. I've done a lot of short essays. I've done academic work. And I've done novels, not much poetry really, both by contemporary writers like Edi Di Luca, Fabio Genovesi. And more recently, I've done some of the classic writers, Moravia, Agostino, and currently I'm working on the big Italian classic, I Promessi Sposi, the Betrothed, by Alessandro Manzoni. In addition to that, I do a lot of interpreting at film events, and I've done it for the Open Roads Italian Film Festival at Lincoln Center every June, except, of course, the past year. And various retrospectives of Italian directors. So it's been a really great way to live in Italy while living in New York.
Especially now in these times of COVID.
Absolutely. Except now in these times, I tend to look at it retrospectively, since there is so little travel. But I just think with kind of amazement of some of the people that I've worked with, Francesco Rosi, for one, I was never in awe of them while I was with them because it would have made it very hard to interpret. But then when I look back and I say, holy cow, who was that? I look at their work and how important they were and how much I admire them. I am dumbstruck.
Yeah. So tell us about the Christ in Concrete work that you've done. For those who may not be familiar with both the book and what you worked on was the television show that aired in Italy, right? Was it a Rai TV
show?
Yes,
not Christ. You said Christ in Concrete. You meant.
I say that all the time, and
stuck. Yeah.
Yeah, Christ stopped at Emily, not Christ stopped in.
But I was wondering for a second whether I did that one and forgot about it.
I do it every time. Everybody sort of jokes now, ribs me for it.
Anyway, well, for Christ stopped at Emily, it is first of all. When I talk about my going to Italy, I went to Italy in 1975. I had done a couple of years at the University of Chicago and decided that wasn't for me. And I was studying sculpture, and I just felt very fulfilled because it was both, creative, artistically stimulating, physical, and intellectual. And I did want to go overseas. And I don't know, I think there was planted in my heart a fondness for Italy for long reasons that I could go into, some of them biographical, but having had some of my best teachers in the arts at my high school were Italian. The art teacher was Italian. The people that taught chorus were Italian. The people that taught orchestra were Italian. And my favorite English teacher, who I'm still in touch with, was Italian, and he highly recommended that I read Christ Stopped at Eboli before going. Now, it wasn't much of a preparation for Milano, and especially Milano in the 1970s, but it was a remarkable book. And I think it was also, after having read it in English, it was the first book that I read in Italian, and was just, it just takes you into a whole world that you might think, is in the past, but of course he was writing in the early 40s about something that happened in the 30s. But even being in Italy in the 70s, I have to say, and even being in the north, if you went up some of the mountains, you felt like you were going back centuries. So after, many years later, and it was through my interpreting work that I came to know Bruce Goldstein and Adrian Halpern of Rialto Pictures. And they're also, they show their work they're very involved with the Film Forum. And they had seen me interpreting and wanted me to work on subtitles with them, because they really pay a lot of attention to it and are very unhappy with some of the subtitles of classic films and the way that they're done. So I happily collaborated on a few films, Senso being one. And then they asked me to do, and a long sort of dream project of Bruce had been to do Christ Died at Eboli in the original TV version, which is 4 episodes shown on successive nights on RAI, the Italian state broadcaster, because it had been given a theatrical release, so cut down to just like, a couple of hours, I guess.
I remember seeing when it came out in New York City, the film version.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think he said he saw it once at one of the uptown theaters.
I think it might have been the Paris Theater or something.
Probably,
like that.
Or no, well, the theatrical version, yes, but the TV version was shown. What was the name of that movie theater way uptown on Broadway in '90s?
Not the Talia.
I think that's where he saw it. And he'd been wanting to, first he had to track down, because he couldn't find it in the RA archives. And then he did find the film. I think it was Castaldi and then he wanted to, do the subtitles. It was funny. We had no script to work with. I just had to listen to the audio. And there is a lot of dialect because, first of all, Francesco Rosi, the director, is from the South. He's from Naples. Most of his films were contemporary. He did docudrama, and he was investigating the collusion between the mafia and politics. His first film is brilliant, Salvatore Giuliano, and he always filmed in the places where the events took place. Mm-hmm. Second film was also well-known, Hands Over the City, about real estate collusion, and done in Naples.
Yeah.
And here instead, in the late 70s, he takes this book from I guess it was published 1945, and goes back in the past and uses a literary source, rather than a kind of a documentary, this is what is happening now, and shot it in the places where it takes place, in Agliano, which in the book is called Galliano, that sort of subtle changing of names to avoid indicting the guilty. And so it was a process of, I have to say, doing the dialect was very interesting, because the peasants, first of all, my whole approach to the subtitling in this case was to give the American viewer as much of an experience of the original as an Italian would have, which meant also accepting that they would not understand everything that's said. That sometimes there's a vice in subtitling where they tell you, they write out every word, and even the background music, they start writing down the words to it. And it might be relevant, but I'm not convinced that a viewer of the original film, not only in this case, but in many others, would have been paying much attention to the words. They might just recognize the song, and it will have an emotional resonance with them. I wanted if an Italian would not have known what was being said, I'm like, then why should an American? Although here and there are some quips that you just sort of need to get across. So you have in the very first scene, I puzzled over it for weeks, and luckily a colleague of mine, where I was working many years at the Italian mission to the UN, and you have a sort of rotating cast of characters, people who come and stay for 4 years and then go on to another posting. And he was from Basilicata, which in the film is called Lucania. And so he was able to tell me what this one woman in this little bus with 2 chickens was saying when she got mad at the narrator whose dog started barking, But there are many instances where you just don't understand what they're saying, and the narrator himself, the figure playing Levi, speaks in Turin dialect, and so there's this big contrast also between the northern Italian language and I wouldn't say Southern Italian; that's too general, but certainly the Lucchese the Lucano, I'm sorry, that they were speaking there in Agliano. There's a lot of talk about immigration, because you have this group that is there. It is a very interesting area. I mean, very backward on the one hand, but in the modern times, one of the areas that has produced a high number of lawyers and doctors and professionals, and also a region that I guess had used its European Union funding very wisely. I know there's a whole group of citizens of Basilicata here in New York meets regularly.
Yep.
So, and then there was also a broader north-south contrast in terms of the central government being Rome, and they sort of felt forgotten by the central government, and just Italian history, Italian unification, where a northern king, Victor Emmanuel II, became the king of all of Italy, and the south, which had been ruled by the Bourbon kings, out of Naples, was suddenly under foreign occupation. It had been under foreign occupation anyway, let's put it that way. But then, with the unification of Italy, they sort of were ruled by, again, what they felt was another foreign power. The immigration story that I mentioned is when you see a little group of men in the film talking about America and what it meant for them. And in this case, America does mean United States. You never know in Italian when they say Le Americhe or America, once upon a time, whether they're talking about South America and I always thought it was very funny that they talk about North and South America as a single continent. America, it's just remarkable to me. And Europe and Asia as two separate continents. I never quite grasped that concept. But at any rate, they talk about having been betrayed twice, because they had been doing well. They'd been working hard in America, New York, during manual labor. And they were tempted back to Italy by fascist propaganda saying that everything was fine. Because the fascists, on the one hand, they needed the money, they needed the foreign support. They had a whole operation in the United States of propaganda. They needed the money that the migrants were sending home, the whole remittances, which is still such a big part of the economy of many countries in the world. And they were tempted back, thinking that the times of prosperity were back. They returned, they found a girl, got married, bought a plot of land, probably at inflated prices, and boom, there they were, stuck,
Yeah. Well, both my grandfathers returned in the 30s. Not because of fascist propaganda. One, because he had made enough money and wanted his goal was always to return, while my paternal grandmother wanted to stay in New York. I've since heard, because there was a kind of freedom that she didn't have in this small town in Abruzzo. And my on the maternal side of my family, it was the second wife who had come to the United States and wanted to return because she didn't like New York. It was too complicated and too difficult.
That's the story you hear more frequently, right? Of the woman wants to return and the man wants to stay. That reminds me of, in terms of translation, even the word migration. First of all, the fact that migration is never just one way, and it's not a single trip. There's so much back and forth and back and forth. People coming for a while and then making some money, then going back and then running out of money and then coming here again and back. With the kids, of course, being carried back and forth. Going to different school systems, I've met so many people in that situation where they were yanked out of one school, put into another, doing maybe all A's in America and then getting, sent back in Italy or the other way around.
Yeah. I mean, this paternal grandfather, he was born in New York at the end of the 19th century. And because his, my great grandparents had come here. It's Italian Italian migration, I think is a more useful word, has always been a continuous flow. Leaving, coming back, and new people arriving, internal migration as well. So it's been the constant of Italian history from before unification.
Now let's talk about the word migration for a second, because I'm
Sure.
glad that you brought that up. When I arrived in Italy, I was in northern Italy, and I too was, a kind of immigrant in that case, right? But the northern Italians, seeing me as an American and having their own sort of national pride and their local prejudices, would pull me aside and talk about the immigranti. And the immigranti that they were talking about were from the South. It's just sort of shocking to me. And no, we're not like them, non siamo come loro.
Right.
And with all of the horrible stereotypes that they made about immigranti, immigrants from the South, from within their own country. And then suddenly, when Italy sort of started, once the sort of terror and political upheaval of I suppose it's never ended, but certainly that of the 1970s and early 80s ended. And then there was a period of prosperity of sorts. And they started talking about themselves. And political propaganda became, we are no longer a country of emigration. We are a country of immigration. And I would have to translate that in terms that Americans would understand. And you're like, well, we're no longer a country that people are leaving. We're a country that people are moving to.
Right.
And then, of course, with the breakup of Albania, suddenly the word immigranti took on a whole other connotation, where they started, and to my horror, I think it was before there was such a political use of migrants, as a wedge issue. I was sort of horrified that in Italy they started talking so negatively about immigrants. And then thinking, in America, this will never happen. And of course, here we are in 2020 with, again, immigration being one of the great wedge issues in our national political discourse.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I also found interesting, from the Italian diasporic perspective is the fact that it's been noted that Italians have given short shift to their history of emigration, right? Not incorporating it into their history books, not dealing with it in kind of as part of the national consciousness, but it became much more important to them as all of a sudden these wave of immigrants were arriving, first from Albania, then from Africa, and even from Latin America, the Philippines, from all over the world. And all of a sudden they discovered their immigration history. And it continues to appear to me as if, well, we were immigrants too. We understand the situation, or the situation was bad for us, but we didn't do XYZ negative thing that these new immigrants are doing. So the Italy's immigration history became a kind of political tool in contemporary Italian politics that always feels uncomfortable. And I guess we hear that in the United States as well. The European immigrants and their descendants from the turn of the century, all white, have now used that same kind of rhetoric. We didn't come here illegally. We pulled ourselves up by the bootstraps, et cetera, et cetera. And so that sort of the history of migration becomes this hammer to push one's political position that is not in line with the historical facts.
Yeah, which reminds me of something also recent, which is Italy has the status of Italians abroad. I think for voting purposes, and since we are still, in the aftermath of our own big national election, it's important to bring it up. Which is that when I lived in Italy, I voted in the American elections, but for my congressional district, the one that I was from in southeastern Massachusetts. But for many years, you had the Italians abroad, so people with an Italian passport who live in the United States, and they created a kind of district. There is this sort of district which is of Italians abroad, like all of North America suddenly becomes a kind of congressional district. And there had been many years, it was primarily the left in Italy was against extending the vote to Italians abroad, thinking that Italians abroad were a block of right-wing voters. And instead, I think with the creation, I guess, of the Democratic Party, the left, and with Prodi running, not Prodi, but with the Democratic Party running for control of the country. The Democrats won thanks, by a very narrow margin, thanks to the Italians abroad.
Yep.
Which shows you also the misconceptions that people have about. I think I've also, through my work at the Italian mission, I've also worked a lot with the consulate. And whenever we're hiring someone, it's really a wonderful opportunity to meet various people who are sort of in this area between Italy and America, either Italian Americans, Italians that live here, Americans that know Italian well, and hearing their stories, because my only job is to judge whether or not they speak good English. And what better way than to ask about their histories? And that's right. It's been such an instructive experience.
Right. Well, the voting question brings up the whole matter of citizenship in Italy, in which the descendants of Italian immigrants can reclaim their Italian citizenship and then vote in these various elections, as I've done. Yeah. So I'm both an American and an Italian citizen. But of course, what is the real issue now with immigration in Italy is that not only is it difficult, so that Italian people born of immigrant parents, but born and raised in Italy, socialized in Italy, are not automatically given Italian citizenship. This is something I think for Americans find this, somewhat difficult to understand, and this has become a real crisis for Italian society and for all those people who are struggling to be a better, part of Italian life.
Yeah. At the same time, as Italy sort of looks toward immigrants to solve its demographic problem, it has a very low birth rate, And of course, with fewer and fewer young people entering the workforce, tax base decreases, and it's a crisis for the whole pension system and the whole social safety net. They know that they need the immigrants, but it is a political, hot button issue. So people are afraid to touch it.
Yeah. So let us get back to translation.
Yes.
This is great. This is exactly what I had hoped this Calandra Corner would be, that it would be a chat and we would go where we want with it for each of the guests. But tell us about the I Promessi Sposi. Tell us about Manzoni and the novel. I've never read it. And I'm waiting for your translation to come out so I can do so. But tell us a little bit about the importance of this book in Italian literature.
Sure. Well, I'll start at the end. My translation will be coming out in the summer, so keep your eyes peeled.
I will.
And I'm in the final editing process. Manzoni is every town you go to in Italy is going to have a Piazza Manzoni, a Via Manzoni, as you get to the north, as you get to Como, where this novel begins with one of the famous openings, that branch of Lake Como, I'll have to read it to you later. It's somehow not coming to me right now, but there you find everything named after characters in the book, and it begins this novel, The Betrothed, in near Lecco, so on the Lecco branch of Lake Como, with a peasant couple trying to get married. And it takes place 1628. The overlord, sort of evil character in the book, Don Rodrigo, has his eye instead on the girl Lucia and threatens the priest, saying, "Don't you dare marry them." And so the priest calls off the wedding without ever explaining it, sending these two characters into a kind of migratory flight. The girl going to a convent in Monza for asylum or shelter, and the boy, Renzo, going to Milan and getting caught up in the waves of history. This is a novel that every Italian knows. It's required reading in their schools. Some might love it, some might hate it, because it is difficult. And they're required often, they were once required to memorize long passages of it. And in the schools, their testing system is more oral. They call it an interrogation. And so they would have to have a fairly sophisticated commentary on various passages. So it's universally known. It is quoted all the time, particularly nowadays with the pandemic, because a novel As I said, it takes place in northern Italy and Lombardy, and particularly Milano, 1628 to 1630. So it begins in a period when Milan is under Spanish occupation. And you see that all the rulers are Spanish, and they're speaking Spanish here and there. There's little snatches of it. And the 30 Years' War has begun. And in northern Italy, there's a war for the succession of Mantua, that Mantua being in Lombardy, right south of Milan. The Duke, the last Duke, has died. And the nearest heir actually is French. And the Spanish instead, who rule there, and the Austrians, also part of the same Habsburg family, do not want the French in northern Italy. So this sparks a war, a kind of proxy war between France, Spain, and then with the Austrian troops sort of coming in order to prevent Mantua from falling into French hands, which eventually it did. Also, it was a useless war. And but because of all of this big war effort, at the same time as there's a famine, it's very, very hard on the people. So it's a very historical novel. I mean, Manzoni goes and he finds the documents of the period. He reads the various accounts. He uses the names of the actual characters the personages who were involved in this history, at the same time as he has this sort of fictional story. But it culminates in 1630 with the Great Plague, because with the arrival of the troops, the Landesknechts, they were called, these mercenaries from Germany, Switzerland, they bring with them the plague. And there had been various waves of the plague that came in, but in this case, it was brought in, and it wiped out a good 25% of northern Italy. And it's suddenly, toward the end of in these two chapters, which have been widely cited in the newspapers, in the Italian newspapers, starting in the spring, there is this very, very accurate description of the plague arriving in Milan and in Lombardy, the terrible damages that it done, but also the inadequate response of the public authorities and even of the public health authorities. The health authorities actually warning the governors that the plague is there and what needs to be done. And instead, the governor of the Duchy of Milan being so caught up in this war effort that he completely ignores all the advice, as well as the city council of the time, the nobles of the city, sort of ignoring all the warnings that they're getting from the chief health officials. So it is very eerie because it's so reminiscent. It's just such an accurate portrayal, not just of what happened then, but of what we see happening today, not just in Italy, but in the United States.
Right.
And so, yeah.
No, go.
No, so the very first lines, of chapter 31 are quoted widely in all of the Italian newspapers. And I did, at the time, I was working on the novel. I'd been working on my translation for a few years. And with that, I said, wow, I sent to the editors these chapters, and they were kind of blown away. So we sort of put together just a sort of compact excerpt of the plague and published it in an online review. And so, and I think it also made them much more excited about the book than they had been. Right.
Mm-hmm. Correct me if I'm wrong. Was the book originally written in dialect?
That's an interesting question. And of course, you'll see that I always give long answers. I suppose I picked this up from the Italians. It's funny because, first of all, for Manzoni, Italian was a foreign language. Okay, he was from Lombardy, and he was educated at the schools in that area. But let's remember that really up until the television era, until the 1950s, in Italy, something like 80% of the people spoke just dialect, or mostly dialect. Italian was something that you learned at school. This is true not just of the South, but of the North. And Manzoni wrote, he began writing as a poet, these very sort of rhetorical poems, talking a lot about Napoleon, actually, and sort of in praise of Napoleon, who had brought some modicum of modernity to northern Italy with all the resentment there is toward him and all the destruction that he caused. Still, it was quite revolutionary when you sort of look at what he did to the laws. And he wrote a couple of verse dramas, sort of in moving sort of from a very kind of a neoclassical vein to a romantic vein, and hit upon writing this novel then as his great literary work. He wrote an earlier version, which was never published, called Fermo e Lucia, which is full of, it's written in his attempt to write Italian. So it is Italian, but with lots of things that are not considered proper Italian and that are considered incorrect, and with the many expressions from the Lombard dialect. He was actually fluent in French. He on his mother's side of the family, he was from a very prominent family, Cesare Beccaria, the author of Paine's, the very first tract against capital punishment written in Western Europe. And his mother had then moved with her lover to Paris, and he spent years in Paris with her. He corresponded fluently in French. When he did, he then rewrote this first version of the novel and published it in 1827 as I Promessi Sposi, we call it the Betrothed, but the Promised Spouses, which would be a horrible title in English. In that version, the 1827, which they call La Ventisettana, the Italians sort of date it, it's there are expressions that are not considered pure Italian. There is a regional snobbery, let's face it. This is a debate that goes all the way back to the 14th century. Even Dante takes it up, like, what is good Italian? And even today, what is good Italian? And it doesn't even just mean grammatically correct. It means stylistically, is this pleasing? Does this meet our expectations of, eloquence and of the very flowery language too? So he was not, he had there was some criticism of this version of this earlier edition. And so he went back and he consulted various people from Florence. Because, of course, in the debates over the centuries, Florentine always came out on top as the most eloquent version of Italian. And it's an important debate, not just in Italy, but throughout Europe. And the Europeans all look to Italy sort of as an example of, like, how do we defend our national language against the primacy of Latin, which at that point was not a dead language, in that it was still used for writing, but it was a dead language and then it wasn't being used for speaking. But it was permanent, and then you had all these great writers. And Dante, from the start, just says, well, the thing is that Florence has the best poets. So this is the best Italian, by virtue of having had the best users of that dialect. Mm-hmm. And that kind of became the argument throughout the centuries. And Manzoni, at the same time as he is modernizing Italian, because he's recognizing that written Italian, which is pretty much like the Italian that you'll see in Mozart, maybe in Rossini, using all sorts of terms that are no longer used, was very old-fashioned. And that Italy, at the same time, as it was moving toward national unity, becoming a nation as opposed to a bunch of colonies of the various European powers, as it was emerging into a nation of its own, needed a national language. The language was there, but it was out of date. So Manzoni made a huge contribution, I think, to Italian through this novel, not just in terms of the message of the novel, but in terms of forging a national language that was modern, So even though, looking at it today, I have to say, wow, I just feel bad for Italian school kids having to read this because it is so far away from contemporary Italian, now that Italian is a national language and it is spoken,
So as the translator, how do you grapple with turning in this sort of older written Italian into an English that contemporary Americans and other Anglophones will find appealing, useful?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I say is that Manzoni was writing a modern language, okay? Because some people say, oh, do you want to use 19th century English? I'm like, apart from the fact that I wouldn't be capable, it would make no sense. And I would end up creating a beautiful object, maybe, but like the wallpaper is beautiful, right? Would it be readable? These long novels of the 19th century function and are readable because of the dynamism that they have, the color, the energy. There's a lot in Manzoni that reminds me of Dickens, very colorful characters. The language is very lyrical in moments, but it varies all the time. He is always shaking things up. And so he's drawing you along not only through the characters in the story, but just through this language that he uses. Very punchy, very ironic. He's always sort of stepping in himself. So I try to capture that color. I use, I want a modern American English, first of all. I don't think it has been translated by an American ever. The other versions available are British English with all these very strange expressions. I don't want anyone to experience this as something that is just too weird. What I preserve, obviously, are the sentences, but his sentences are very, very long. And English won't allow for that. So I do make them into smaller sentences. But his sentences are not linear. Like in English, we want subject, verb, object. And, I'm right now in the midst of going through the edits that I've received where the editor is trying to straighten out all my sentences. But I'm like, no. He writes in circles sometimes, or he might put the object at the beginning. And there's going to be lots of little interruptions in the sentences. So that's part of the beauty of his language. And that is what I want to convey. But it's also very important, and this is an essential aspect, an essential contribution of an editor in a process when you're translating, is that it has to be beautiful to the American reader. Mm-hmm. That they have to get the pleasures of this book. And I don't want them to be feeling like all of this tension with the Italian underneath. I think the previous translations are trying so hard to capture every little nuance of the novel that they really end up creating something that I find unreadable and very unpleasant. And I want this throughout to be, pleasant. I mean, there are moments that are undoubtedly difficult, I do have to unravel them a little bit and then ravel them back up in a way. But using always, when I say contemporary English, I mean, even though it's tempting to say awesome here and there or throw in an obscenity, I can't do that. So I have to sort of in my head think of, well, what is standard English even? What is good modern English? I never use a dictionary more often in my life just to sort of date certain expressions, because sometimes I might think, oh, that's too contemporary. I look it up and I'm like, oh no, it was first used in the 18th century. We're good,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So talking about sort of, you were saying about Manzoni's style, how do you, as a translator, how do you parse what's just kind of the Italian language and what's Manzoni's style that he's adding to the Italian language that would be different from somebody else? And then how do you convey that in English?
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know. Good. When I say good question, I mean like, I don't know if I can answer that. But I think I just have to go with my own knowledge of Italian. I've got a bunch of commentaries, which are very dense. There's so many of them. I mean, I think that the Italians have written more about Manzoni, they have actually, than any other Italian prose writer. Mm. And when you go to like the section of a research library dedicated to Italy, there's like a whole wall of Dante, a whole wall of Petrarch, and a whole wall of Manzoni.
Right.
So finding a good commentary was very helpful. I think that he uses, there's a lot of religious content. There's a big conversion that takes place. There are San Carlo Borromeo and then his nephew, who became the Archbishop of Milan, Federico Borromeo, are there. Those are, I had mentioned there being various kinds of language use. He quotes from 17th century documents, which are Baroque. There, I have to use a very twisted kind of English. I mean, modern words, but very allegorical, very highfalutin. Mm-hmm. In order to convey that attitude. The peasants speak, and I just try to make them not sound like they're from Brooklyn, but to make them sound like, a little bit rustic, Right. So in terms of, when you say what is Manzoni's style, that's hard. I think his style comes across probably the most, because he has many styles in the novel, is what I'm saying. But
because of the different speakers, the different characters.
The different speakers, and also the different moments. He does these long sort of fugues about nature, beautiful passages describing the landscape. And this is something, he has influenced all Italian writers that came after him. And one of the things that I've noticed in all the Italian books I've done, there's probably 25 at this point, is that Italian novels tend to be very strong on still lives and landscapes. They have a way of just describing things without anything really happening. They can often be weak on character and maybe on plot, with the exception, of course, of the Ferrante novels, the Neapolitan Quartet, which is a real lesson, I think, to Italian writers that, hey, let's get a plot, let's have engaging characters. So I find that probably the hallmark of his style really are these passages dedicated to nature and his irony. And now irony is a really tricky thing to translate because in irony, you're saying one thing to mean another. If you do it literally, it might not work,
Right.
And so there, it's like it's translating a joke,
Right.
You can't just translate it. You have to get the laugh. You have to get the punchline. So I'd say that these two things are very typical of him: the irony, the fact that he, as the author, is constantly stepping in, and then suddenly reminiscing about something. And something that I've done, which is a little different, he uses noi, the we, the sort of authorial we, when he steps in to comment on the action. And I think that's very old-fashioned in English. So I used I. That way we know that it's him stepping in, And so that is an example of, translation, but where I have to sort of, change it a little bit in order to convey what exactly he's doing and to get that sort of sharp difference. Because I don't want it to, of course, a friend of mine said, well, this is sort of straddling the line between the old-fashioned and the new. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. Mm-hmm.
What was the question? I had a question, and then I kind of got lost on made me think of the voi and the lay. Kind of totally got sidetracked.
That's funny because they use it. That's hard to do,
Yeah.
They use a voi, in this novel, they use a voi a lot.
Okay.
And within the family, there's no lay. There's no
Okay.
lay that I can think of. There's a voi a lot. There's a tu among nobles. But that's very hard to do,
Right.
I don't find it's not as much of an issue in this novel as it would be in a lot of other things that I've approached, although there are big class differences. One of the words that's kind of hard to do is signore, because today we say signore, you just think Mr.
Right. Yeah.
A signore is a nobleman,
Right.
And this is very much about class differences, and about the fact that the boy, Renzo, comes from mountains, and they call him, I didn't know how to say it. To call him a mountaineer makes him sound like he's climbing mountains. It's like to call him a hill person makes it sound like he's from Tennessee or something,
Right.
But they're rustic. They're from the hills. They're from the mountains, really.
And what did you choose to call him?
I'm still working on that one. I think I had said mountaineer. I said, from the mountains.
Right.
Country boy. I just think country. I think flat land.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's a little tricky.
It is, I bet. And this is
signore, I guess, is the thing I've been most involved in. There is one of the main characters in the novel is La Signora, who is a nun, and the Nun of Monza, and that's an independent. It's a whole little novella. It is a beautiful portrait, very modern, I think, in the psychological portrait it gives of a girl from a rich family being forced into the convent. In order for the father, who had a large family, but in order for the eldest son to inherit everything, all of the other children, the boys were forced into the monastery and the girls into a convent. And it talks about this girl being forced into the convent and then becoming a bit of a witch within the convent. And they call her La Signora because this means that she is a noblewoman, a princess of sorts. And I kept Signora in her case. Just call her the lady. Of course, I would automatically think of the Madonna, and that just
and lady also sort of seems a little too British or something.
In a way, yeah. Although the Brits do have an advantage in British English in talking about class difference. I think that we indicate it in different ways in America.
Right.
With the lay, it's sort of funny. I remember reading a study by a linguist talking about, well, how do Americans indicate deference if we don't have the lay, if we don't have this formal you? And this guy said, we giggle. Like I'm doing now, right? Like when you're talking with your boss, how do you indicate linguistically that he's the boss? And you giggle a little bit,
I always remember when I was in Italy in the 70s, and I wasn't. I mean, and while it was a kind of Italian was my first language, but I forgot when I lost it. I mean, there wasn't that memory of knowing it early on, so I had to relearn it in a sense, or learn it from scratch. And it took me forever to get the tu and the lei and when to use it. But I remember being in a relative's small town in Abruzzo, and an elderly woman came up to me and addressed me with the voi, and I literally turned around to see if anybody was behind me to see if she was talking to more than one person. And it was a real kind of struggle at that moment. And I kind of, oh, this is what I've heard about. And here it is instilled in it. Because I had always heard that it was, this imposed fascist kind of use. And to find that it was still at that time, as talking again about the 70s as a time when there were still folks who were living a life that was not dissimilar to Levi's Christ stopped at Eboli. There it was in sort of linguistically in action for me.
I taught Italian also at various as an adjunct at CUNY at Hunter College, Baruch. And it was tough, I remember, for my Italian American students, because maybe they thought it was going to be an easy A. And it was tough because they knew everything that I was saying. They understood everything, but when they had to reproduce it,
right, it was,
those things that you learn in elementary Italian, the rules of singular, plural, the articles, agreement. Those are the things that are very different in dialect. I remember I had one Sicilian student. I was teaching at Penn State where I got my master's. And he was going to Baltimore, so I had him bring a package to my younger sister who was working there at the time. And he comes back to me, and I said, well, so did you meet my sister? He says, he says, ite bona. I almost fell off my chair. I'm like, you don't say that,
Right. And that I know that this has been a sort of an issue, and though I'm not one that I'm well versed in, but I've heard over the years of how sort of Italian professors, not just professors of Italian, but Italian professors have dealt with derisively Italian American, and probably even in other places like Canada and Australia, kind of their the children of immigrants and their understanding of Italian versus various other Italian languages like Sicilian or Neapolitan, and how there's been less of an empathy to sort of work with them to get them to understand standard Italian, as opposed to simply dismissing, you don't know what you're talking about, and just wiping everything off the board. I've heard a lot of stories over the years.
That leads me to a question that I have for you, really, since you are within the CUNY system. For native Spanish speakers or the children of immigrants, they speak to them. They refer to them now as heritage speakers.
Yes.
And there are courses, Spanish for Spanish speakers, which I think is a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
I don't know that you have enough numbers in New York to do it, but has there been any talk of having Italian for Italian speakers?
I don't know. I haven't heard of any. I mean, that may have been the case, let's say, back in the 70s when you had this second wave of Italian immigration after the war. And you had, entering into CUNY, you had a number of the children of immigrants, but also a lot of immigrants. I mean, I went to Brooklyn College in the 70s, and there was a whole contingent of Italians who arrived when they were 7 years old, 14 years old, and a lot of them predominant in the Italian department. But I know that what is happening in CUNY is teaching Italian to speakers of Romance languages. Which has been really, really important for people who are from Latin America, Haitians, who have really stepped into being the dominant group of taking Italian language courses in the CUNY system.
Yeah.
So that they've been attuned to. There's a way of teaching Italian to people who know Spanish and French or Portuguese that can be sort of more cognizant of what the possibilities are there.
And it also reminds me, among my former colleagues of the Italian mission, they are changing posts every 4 years, and they have families, they have children who are speaking Italian at home, but who will never, well, I don't want to say never, but maybe, who are going to have difficulty with academic Italian.
Right.
So much of the hiring process in Italy is based upon writing, in office jobs and stuff. And in government jobs, you do these written essays and stuff. And it's not even just a question of whether something is grammatically correct. It's, do they have that style? Do they have that indirect style? This fact that it's considered impolite almost to be too, direct about things, and you sort of have to talk around things a little bit for it to be considered good Italian.
Right. That reminds me. Haven't done the translations, but I've been involved in editing books that of originally published in Italian, academic works, essays, and looking over the English translations, and some of those translations being done by folks whose English may not be their first language, but and even reading some social science essays written in Italian, and this kind of from an English-speaking American, this kind of, as you said, this indirect, this kind of loopiness where sentences go on forever, and you read it and you go, okay, I understand the Italian, but I have no idea what this author is saying, because in the end, there's you don't know what the subject is at a certain point, 17 phrases into this sentence. And, as you suggested before, I remember having, in partnership with Anthony Tamburi on a book that we co-edited of this English translation, having to take a sentence and then chop it up into several sentences. And then even to insert the subject to a sentence that kind of didn't have it in Italian, this indirect style that you're talking about.
Yeah, because Italian being an inflected language, they can just sort of hide the pronouns and not make them explicit, and it's considered bad style, I don't like translating academic essays because it really does become a complete rewrite. And I think that some of the style is just that, sometimes in academic writing, better than me, I mean, you just want to advertise that you're smart. Apart from whatever the point of the essay is, you're like, look, I'm smart. I can use this word. I can say this. I always laugh because Italians love to say, as everyone knows, and this is usually used to introduce a very obscure fact. And so if you're too clear, then you're considered stupid almost.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I've been watching some webinars on Italian coming out of Italy on various topics, and it reminds me of this kind of issue concerning about style in terms of language, where people are speaking for a long time and are kind of, to my ear, not getting to the point. Michael, anything else?
Maybe we could close. I could read just a very short excerpt.
That'd be wonderful.
Which is in chapter 33, when Renzo comes back to Milan after a whole long adventure that I won't go into, and he finds a city that has been struck by the plague, that is very different from the place that he had been in 2 years earlier. And he is treated as a foreigner, which he is, of course. And he actually has been, he had found asylum, or he had escaped from Milan, where he got in trouble, from the state of Milan, and gone to Bergamo, which at the time was under the Venetian Republic. So it's like a foreign country, even though it was within. So we can just end with this. He's just gotten to what at the time was called the Porta Orientale, which nowadays I think is Porta Venezia, and manages to sneak. And there is an order not to let foreigners inside the city gates. So he has to figure out how he can do this. He passed the stockade, passed the gate, and continued on without anyone noticing or minding him. Except after taking about 40 steps, another "You there" was shouted at him by a customs officer. This time he pretended not to hear, and without turning around started to walk more quickly. "You there," the customs officer shouted again, but in a voice that indicated impatience rather than a determination to be obeyed. And since Renzo ignored him, he shrugged his shoulders and returned to his sentry box, like a man more worried about keeping his distance from pedestrians than inquiring into their business. The road that Renzo had taken used to lead, and still does, to the canal known as the Naviglio. It was lined on both sides by hedges or garden walls, churches and monasteries, and only a few houses. At the end of this street, and in the middle of the one that ran alongside the canal, stood a column with a cross called the Sante Eusebio cross. It was the only thing Renzo could see no matter how far ahead he looked. Upon reaching the fork in the road at the halfway point, he looked in both directions. To the right, on the road called the Santa Teresa Stradone, he saw a citizen walking toward him. A human being at last, he said to himself, and turned that way, thinking he might get directions. The man had also seen the stranger approaching, and with a suspicious look on his face, was eyeing him warily from afar, especially when he realized that rather than continuing past, the stranger was instead walking right toward him. As Renzo approached, being a respectful country lad, he removed his hat. With his left hand holding the hat and his right inside the crown, he went up to the unknown man. But the latter, his eyes popping out, took a step back, raised his knotty walking stick, pointed its steel tip at Renzo's waist, and shouted, "Keep your distance." Oh, cried the young man. He put his hat back on, having no desire to get into a fight right then, as he would later tell the story, turned his back on the bizarre man and continued on his way, or rather in the direction in which he was already going. The other man also went on his way, trembling all over and constantly looking over his shoulder. Once he arrived home, he claimed he had been accosted by an anointer with a meek and mild demeanor. The anointers, they claimed that the plague was being spread by people anointing or spreading, this sort of this yellow substance, which they thought was a plague, on the walls. An anointer with a meek and mild demeanor, the face of an evil impostor, and a little box of unguent or a packet of powder, he wasn't sure which, either in his hand or in the crown of his hat, ready to play a dirty trick on him if he hadn't chased him away. One more step, he added, and I'd have run him through before he got the better of me, the scoundrel. Unfortunately, we were in an isolated place. If it had been the center of Milan, I'd have called for help and got people to grab him. They'd have found that evil potion in his hat for sure, but there by my lonesome, the best I could do was scare him away, to keep myself out of harm's reach. It only takes a second to throw a little powder, and they're quite good at it. And they've got the devil on their side. Now he's making the rounds in Milan. God only knows how many victims he's taken. For the rest of his life, which was a long life indeed, whenever the conversation turned to the anointers, he would repeat his story, adding, "Anyone who still insists it isn't true had better not say it to my face. Seeing is believing."
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much.
And I look forward to the publication of the I Promessi Sposi in English.
No more than I do.